workforce or the school to workforce pipeline, especially for careers or jobs that require formal education. And today I'm sharing insights into how colorism impacts educational outcomes even before children enter formal schooling. And of course, we often forget that schools are also workplaces. So a lot of what I discuss today can be applied to the workplace more broadly, not just to educational institutions. But before we get into that, I'd like to welcome you to yet another weekly live stream with yours truly, Dr. Sarah L. Webb. I am the founder of Colorism Healing, a leader in raising awareness, shifting attitudes, and taking action to dismantle colorism around the globe. I do that via online content such as this, but also through public speaking, facilitating workshops, and professional trainings. And if you'd like to learn more about my services, you can visit my website, colorismhealing.com. This live series is part of an ongoing series based on my recent ebook, Corporate Colorism, Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. So if you haven't seen previous episodes or read previous articles, be sure to go to the archives and check them out. And if you're on LinkedIn, there's a newsletter you can subscribe to so that you don't miss out on forthcoming live streams and articles. Now, I want to begin by looking at some of the research on education and colorism in schools. And you might already be able to tell that this live stream is a little different because it is pre-recorded, so I'm not live with you, although my goal is to engage in the chat while these videos are premiering on LinkedIn and YouTube. But since I'm low on tech, after traveling to Costa Rica, I have handwritten notes. So if I look down periodically at my notes, it's because I had to scribe everything out for myself for this particular week. And so one of the first studies I want to share looked at Asian American and Latino students, and it found that those with lighter skin tones were more likely to complete high school and matriculate onto college campuses than their darker skin counterparts. And this study was also conducted among siblings, so accounting for things like differences in socioeconomic status or parenting styles or just home environment in general, right? A second study looked at suspension rates for African American girls. And that study looked at the African American girls with very light skin tones, dark skin tones, and very dark skin tones. And so there was a disparity between those with the darkest skin tones and those with the lighter skin tones. And those with darker skin tones were 3 times more likely to be suspended than those with the lightest skin tones. And again, this was controlling for things like GPA, prior disciplinary infractions, socioeconomic status, the type of school that they attended, relationships with teachers, and that sort of thing. So even controlling for all these other variables, there was a 3 times the amount of disparities between suspension rates for African American girls. And we often focus on suspension rates and educational outcomes between white people and marginalized groups or people of color, for example. And oftentimes we overlook the fact that even amongst a racial group, there are disparities, hence why I talk about colorism. And in thinking about suspension rates for Black girls, I also think it's an opportune time to look at the connection between the school to workforce pipeline and the school to prison pipeline. So a lot of times we talk about how disciplinary infractions, especially school suspensions or school expulsions, increase the odds of incarceration, right? But they simultaneously decrease the odds of successfully completing school or thriving and excelling at school, right? And so both of those impacts of the school to prison pipeline and things like suspensions and expulsions also decrease career opportunities or restrict career trajectory, right? And so while the school to prison pipeline is increased through suspensions and expulsions, the school to workforce pipeline is decreased because of school suspensions and expulsions. So again, we have to consider not just the racial component of these inequalities and disparities, we also have to acknowledge the research and the data that comes in showing that if you have darker skin tone in particular, you're even more likely to have that negative effect than people with lighter skin tones, even if they identify the same as you racially or ethnically, okay? Now, the third study was also looking at Latinx students, and again, it showed a disparity in educational outcomes, but I'm sharing this because they also noted some possible reasons for the disparity, and they included things like socioeconomic difference, right? So the students with lighter skin tones tended to come from wealthier families. There was also differences in expectations. So teachers had higher expectations for lighter skinned students and had darker skinned students face discrimination and had to deal with lower expectations from their teachers rather. And I also want to share some deeper insights. So that research I think is really important because, again, when it comes to something like colorism, people don't realize that it has systemic impact. And so every time I talk about colorism, I have to cite some type of research to educate the masses of people. But beyond that, I also want to share some things that I observe and some analysis that I have, both of the research, but also qualitative things that I observe, research, and have experienced myself when I was teaching high school. So the first thing is parental privilege. And so this was alluded to in that last study that talked about socioeconomic disparities. So if a light-skinned student also has, or any student actually, also has a light-skinned parent or a non-Black parent or a white parent, they are directly benefiting from their parents' privilege. And so that could, again, look like socioeconomic advantages, being able to have access to schools, private schools, or certain types of academies that have a particular type of focus, or being in a school district with smaller teacher-student ratios, being in a school district that has more funding for extracurricular activities, for resources and upgrading and updating buildings and access to technology and that sort of thing, right? But beyond the socioeconomic benefit that might come from a student having a white parent or a light-skinned parent, or even in many cases a non-Black parent, there's also more cooperation and more benefit of the doubt from school staff and teachers itself. So thinking about parent-teacher conferences and thinking about phone calls to parents, and the teachers and the staff's implicit biases based on race and color will also be benefiting you if benefiting a student if their parent interacting with the teacher happens to also have light skin or be white or be non-Black. And then similarly to that, this is, I think, a more macro scale type of advantage or privilege. But if your parents are lighter skinned, or if your parents are non-Black or white, they also don't have the stress of dealing with anti-Blackness in this world. They also don't have the stress in many cases of dealing with colorism. They also don't have the stress of also having to deal with racism and racial disparities and racial inequalities, right? So there has been lots of research showing that experiencing colorism, experiencing racism, experiencing anti-Black violence, whether it be directly to you or observing it secondhand in the media or in the larger society, does have a negative impact on mental health, but also physical health as well, right? The stress related to that, or that comes from that, negatively impacts, darker skinned Black parents. And so those are some things that we have to take into account in terms of the holistic picture and the ecosystem that can contribute to educational outcomes for students. Now, another form or another reason that we see some of these disparities, again alluded to in one of the research studies I just shared, is teacher expectations. But a lot of this is implicit bias about intelligence in particular, and then also implicit bias about behavior or perceived behavior. And it's important to understand that this starts, again, at home with parents who have not done their inner work, parents who are also colorists, parents who have not done their own self-reflection and self-evaluation and healing around biases towards skin tones. And so we have a lot of parents, far too many, who are prematurely labeling their children's aptitude, right? So even from the womb, even from birth, parents or family members, caregivers, will start to label children as either the smart child or the good child. And they'll start to label children as, the bad child or the quote unquote dumb child, right? And this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can either bolster the educational self-esteem for lighter skinned children who might be favored, and it can simultaneously hinder or wound the educational self-esteem, their self-concept in terms of being, a quote unquote good kid or being a quote unquote good student. And in some cases, this even leads to or contributes to the parents investing greater resources, greater time, greater attention into the lighter skinned children if favoritism is at play. And so maybe sending lighter skinned children to magnet schools, are taking the time to really invest in their extracurricular development, are investing in clubs and sports for them as well. And again, this is both for intelligence and behavior, right? So a lot of times parents will start to label and describe and interact with their children based on these unconscious and sometimes conscious categories that they've started to put them in. Even before, children are learning how to read and talk, and you can see signs of how a child might be inclined to read versus how a child might be inclined to draw, right? So even before you start to get that inclination of what children are leaning towards or where their natural talents might be, they already are starting to track them. And what we also have to understand is that this continues once they enter school. So the same type of labeling, the same type of bias or conditioned attitude about who's more likely to be the smart child, who's more likely to be the well-behaved child, continues and is perpetuated by teachers in the classroom, by staff such as vice principals or secretaries, even guidance counselors, and also classmates, right? And so I was having a conversation with a friend the other day saying how we often talk about how kids are bullied for making good grades or, doing well in school, but kids are also bullied if they fail, if they flunk, or if they make an F, right? So kids get teased and called quote unquote dumb or you're not smart, right? And so a lot of this dynamic in terms of colorism is based in subconscious or unconscious conditioning that tells us throughout the lifespan of people that we perceive, or we're likely to perceive, those with lighter skin as more intelligent, even if there's no quantifiable data to support that, right? So regardless of test scores, regardless of actual school performance, and this is the key, right? Regardless of actual aptitude or educational levels of achievement, we will perceive, if we have not done our inner work to unlearn these biases, we are likely to perceive those with darker skin as being less competent or less intelligent, right? And so we have to actively unlearn these biases. I've created content on how we can do that. So if you're on YouTube in particular, you can search how to unlearn certain biases, right? I did a whole video on how we can start to do that, but also I teach workshops on this as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is the halo effect, also known as the halo error, E-R-R-O-R. I prefer the halo error because it is in fact an error. And so the halo error, more commonly known as the halo effect, tells us that those who we perceive as more beautiful or more attractive, we're also more likely to attribute all sorts of other positive traits to them based on our perception of their beauty. And so this happens when we think the cute kid, the quote unquote, the kid that we think is cuter, we're also more likely to think that they are smarter, that they are more well-behaved, that they have higher potential, right? So again, this can come from parents, this can come from other classmates, it can come from teachers, it can come from staff and administration as well, right? And so because colorism does disproportionately lead people to have a bias in favor of light skin and to assume that light skin is more beautiful, like seeing or associating light-skinned people as being prettier or being more handsome, then that halo effect is more likely to take place in terms of us having positive assumptions and making positive associations with people who have lighter skin. And oftentimes the opposite is true, where because we have been conditioned to dislike dark skin and dislike Afro-textured hair and dislike certain broader features, then we're also more likely to attribute negative traits to people with those phenotypes and with those features and traits. So again, we have to be aware of these things because we can't solve them if we aren't aware of them. And I always tell people, starting to look at your patterns, especially if you work in a school or if you have children or if you are involved. Actually, I think education is everybody's responsibility, regardless of how we're related to it. But since I'm not actually live, this is going to be a much shorter video because there's not going to be any Q&A. Again, I hope you are tuning in for the live because I will try to respond in the chat to any questions that might come up and also in comments. And so your homework, one, is to look for opportunities to sponsor or mentor a dark-skinned student. Also, your homework is to call out colorism in schools when you see it, talk to your teachers, ask your child's teacher, have they heard of colorism? Are they familiar with colorism, right? And then a second homework that I was inspired or I felt motivated to share is to also relax. This week, I want to give you the challenge or the assignment to rest and take a break. We are at the start of the second quarter of the year, so I know a lot of people might be reflecting on what they've done and where they're trying to go, but I think that's also a perfect time, with it being spring and all that sort of thing, to find an hour in the week or a day in the week to focus on relaxing and resting. Okay, and then your affirmation based on that is, today I prioritize my well-being. That would be a good affirmation for every day. But to get us started, let's try having this affirmation just for now, that today I prioritize my well-being. Thank you all so much for tuning in, especially those of you who return week after week. I am so happy and grateful that you are giving your time, attention, and energy into addressing this very important topic that is still severely underaddressed given the scope of its impact. And so I hope you can tune in with me next week. I should be back live next week. I think I have my the required devices and tech pieces that I need should be arriving this week in the next couple of days. So next Monday, I will be live with you again, and we'll be able to interact in real time with your questions and comments via the video. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of